The Frontline Covid-19 Critical Care Alliance, FLCCC, is a group of mostly intensive care doctors who worry about the fixation of many governments on just vaccines in the battle against COVID-19. But vaccines are of no use for sick people. They need a cure. The FLCCC doctors are convinced that the medicine Ivermectin is that cure. Many governments, however, do not allow or discourage the use of ivermectin because of insufficient proof. Dr. Pierre Kory, lung doctor, intensivist and FLCCC director, strongly contests this in a webinar he gave to the Groene Rekenkamer, the Green Accounting Office in English, on April 15, 2021. This is the recording of that event.
So what I wanted to tell you all is that although I'm going to present the science, I want to be clear, is that the controversy or the conflict with the adoption of ivermectin is not about the science. The opposition to ivermectin is using non-scientific tactics to suppress this. And I'm actually, as a scientist, I am actually now exhausted with presenting the science. And the reason why is that the science is being ignored. It's not about the deficits in the science. However, those that are opposed to ivermectin want everyone to believe that the science is insufficient. I will tell you, that's what the first part of my talk is. I'm going to tell you that the opposite is true. The trial evidence is unique in its strength and its diversity. And I'm going to talk about how my group, as well as a number of other expert research groups around the world, have come to the conclusion that this should be the standard of care. If you don't know this, it's not the standard of care. Almost every major public health agency around the world recommends against use. And so I'm going to tell you why that is. So just our group is we're a diverse group of specialties. Most of us are ICU specialists. And again, under Paul Marik, we're all close colleagues of him, but all we've tried to do since the beginning is come up with, based on our expertise, our knowledge of the evidence, knowledge of different therapies and the disease, the most effective treatment protocols. And I tell you that it is my firmly held belief that we've always had the most effective treatment protocols, but they've largely been resisted and attacked. But they're very evidence-based and they're of sound physiology. What's very important to recognize is what I present to you today, at least the overview, it has been accepted in a peer-reviewed publication. It will be online within about a week or two. And that peer review included 2 senior scientists at the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA in the United States, as well as a senior scientist who's part of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And he's a senior scientist. He's one of the most respected scientists in the world. And I passed through peer review, and that was accepted for publication. So that I need you to be clear that this is not just my opinion. Our conclusions, our assessment of the evidence is not only past peer review, but numbers of other expert groups from around the world, Japan, United Kingdom, have all come to the same conclusions. But yet our conclusions are being actively suppressed and dismissed. Briefly, ivermectin. Everyone, if you know about it, you probably know about it as an anti-worming drug for dogs or for parasites. But it's a really important drug in the history of medicine. It won the Nobel Prize, the discoverers, because it essentially transformed the health status of numerous areas of the world, largely low and middle income countries in which parasitic infections were endemic. And it essentially removed a number of diseases, including the disease onchocerciasis or river blindness, in which many areas of Africa, there were communities where half the men were blind by the age of 40. And so essentially restored sight to thousands, if not millions of men across Africa. And so it's a really historic drug in history. And I think it's set to do the same again, but we'll talk about it. The evidence base for ivermectin is based on the fact that for 10 years now, there's been laboratory studies showing ivermectin is a really good inhibitor of many viruses: Zika, dengue, West Nile, influenza. Then there was a trial back in April showing in Australia, a group showed that it was highly effective at interfering with the replication and binding of SARS-CoV-2. So there was lab studies that showed it's highly effective. Now, not everything goes from the bench to the bedside. However, what I'm here to tell you is this drug is going from the bench to the bedside. I mean, it works in the lab, it works in animals, it works in humans, and the clinical effects are profound. Beyond being an antiviral, it also, and this is where it's sort of I have to be careful to call it a miracle drug, but what I'll tell you about is that, to me, this drug, knowing what I know about, and I'm an expert at COVID, the different phases of COVID, is you can't design a better drug for COVID than ivermectin. The reason why is it's a potent antiviral, and it also has potent anti-inflammatory properties. And if you know anything about this disease, it begins as a viral syndrome and what we call the viral replicative phase. But later on, it's severe inflammation, and ivermectin works in all phases. Now, at the bottom, the clinical trials in the past 6 months have shown the following repeatedly in different numbers of trials from different centers. But there's a whole category of trials showing that if you take it, your chances of getting COVID are severely reduced, sometimes, and a number of times, more reduced than a vaccine. And that's a very suppressed secret here, folks. The other thing is that enhanced recovery prevents deterioration into the hospital, and it reduces mortality. Nothing else in COVID, except for steroids and moderate to severe illness late in the phase, has been shown to decrease mortality. And then we also have real-world epidemiologic data showing striking reductions in case fatality rates. And so I'm going to do a quick overview of this evidence. So the trials data, I can't even keep up with, this is probably a month old, and at that time we had 32 controlled trials. 20 were the gold standard randomized controlled trials. Actually, the treatment trials now, it's beyond 17. We're probably near 23, 26. Not all of that data is publicly yet, but I know of the results, and they continue to be positive. In preventive data, we have 3 randomized controlled trials and a number of observational trials. But anyway, there's a very large evidence base on which this sits, and so much so, the one public health agency that actually sought to amass all of the evidence is actually WHO and UNITAID. And I became a close friend and collaborator with Dr. Andy Hill. So he's the lead consultant of this research team. And he has contacted 59 active trialists, and he had results as of a month ago from 17 of them. And he's already presented the results of that analysis of 17 trials to a number of public health agencies. Now, if you look at this slide, this is just the prevention trials. And they generally take 2 forms. So one set is where they take anyone who tests positive and they treat the family, right? So it's called post-exposure prevention. So to prevent the spread in the household. And in these trials, you see these phenomenal benefits. So in this randomized control trial, 340 patients and household members, they showed that if you had someone test positive and you gave the family 2 doses, only 7% actually got COVID in the treated households. In households without, 58%. This is a remarkable reduction. Similarly, in another randomized controlled trial, 2% versus 10%, again, in healthcare workers and household contacts. And then other trials are healthcare workers. If you see these are high-risk patients. And they put one group on ivermectin, the other group not. 21% down to 3%. 11% down to 0, 73% down to 7%. I mean, these are dramatic impacts. I mean, this looks like a vaccine. It literally looks like what a really good vaccine would look like. And in this trial is the most remarkable, which is my colleague, Dr. Carvalho, 1,200 patients here. They volunteered, 708 volunteered to take ivermectin once a week, 407 did not. And look what happened. Nobody got sick versus 58% who got sick. That's just prevention. And these are eye-popping differences. I mean, you cannot ignore these. They're just absolutely overwhelmingly impactful on these. And this is what's called I'm not going to go into this. It's called a forest plot. But this number 1 here is when you see a treatment effect that has no effect. This is on the favors I've. Yeah.
Just for household purposes, you're doing wonderful, but I should ask the audience to ask their questions in the private chat, not in the public chat, in the private chat. Okay, please continue.
Okay. So this is just what's called a forest plot, and it just shows you how tightly and reproducibly the treatment effects align. And the summary estimate of benefit of taking ivermectin preventively is that it reduces the risk to less than 10% compared to those who don't. And if you look at some of the vaccines, do they reduce it to 92% efficacy? Not all of them. And they're changing. Even the ones that had high efficacy, the variants are weakening them. But if you look at ivermectin, it has about a 92% protective effect. In the trials where you took it every week, it was 0. Nobody got sick. So really tremendous result. Now, that was the first kind of bucket of trials. I'm not going to go through them specifically, but this is where we talk about the outpatients' mild to moderate illness. 6 randomized controlled trials, 750 patients, all reproducibly showing time to viral clearance is down, time to getting better is down. Even mortality in this mild illness outpatient trial, one of them showed a mortality benefit, but the rates of deterioration and hospitalization. The case series, unbelievably low rates of hospitalization. So for instance, this one, which I really like, which was emergency room patients, 2,700 patients, 1 person died. Out of 2,700 consecutively treated patients in the emergency room, some of them quite sick, they had an aggressive protocol of ivermectin, only 1 person died, and only 16 entered the hospital out of 2,700 patients. I'm not going to go into this except to say that we know of a number of studies showing profound anti-inflammatory activity, and these are the hospitalized patient trials. So 6 randomized controlled trials, 5 observational, and many of them, the majority showing statistically significant large reductions in mortality. No other drug does that. Now, going beyond those trials evidence, which is growing. So since I put those slides together a month ago, it's just much larger. There's more randomized controlled trials showing this. But there's really compelling what I call real-world evidence. And there's a man named Juan Chimie who's part of our alliance because his work we found so compelling. We asked him to join it. He does a lot of analyses for us now, but he's been doing this work since early on. And one of his first analyses, which came to kind of worldwide attention, in fact, Professor Omura, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of ivermectin, in his lectures on ivermectin and COVID, he uses these slides. He also was compelled with these analyses. But what this shows is the shaded area is before these regions in Peru, these regional health ministers, before they started to distribute ivermectin for the treatment of COVID. And the red is actually excess deaths, not COVID deaths. I'm sorry, it's excess deaths because those are more accurate. And compared to baseline, there was a huge rise in deaths in many of these regions in early COVID. This is last year. But once they started to distribute and use ivermectin, the deaths decreased to almost pre-pandemic levels. Time after time, temporally associated, meaning, this one started here in July, that's when the drop occurred. This one started here in August, September, that's when the drop occurred. This one started here in May, that's when the drop occurred. So every time they did it, it was followed very rapidly by deaths among the population dropped markedly. And when they measured what's called the case fatality rate, also equally important, guys, is a lot of people say, it's a rise in young people with infections that don't die enough. These analyses to remove that confounder was only in patients over 60. So what happened is if you were over 60 years old in some of these regions in Peru, before ivermectin was used in some regions, you had about a 50% chance of dying from COVID if you got it. After ivermectin was used, your chances of dying if you got sick with COVID was reduced to the low single digits. Area after area, time after time, many of them with single-digit mortality rates in elderly patients. It's truly, truly dramatic. This was a military operation that the old government did. The new government came in and stopped it, and cases spiked. But what they did here is they distributed ivermectin through the countryside in Peru in a number of areas over like an 11-day period. Again, the deaths dropped. It was called Mega Operación Taita, or MOT, and it was a military operation. The Navy, the Army went through the countryside distributing it. Now the new government health minister, they don't believe ivermectin works, and they've stopped it. And there's graphs showing that everything is spiked. The deaths are now up again in Peru. This was an analysis where those 8 states that I showed you before in blue compared to red in the background, which is Lima. You saw in Lima, the big city, that's where all the scientists and the ivory towers are and the health ministers are. They don't believe in ivermectin. And when you see in their capital city, you don't see those drops in deaths. You see these massive spikes and these maintained high death rates in the areas where they don't use it. Numerous examples of this occur throughout the world. Here was a mayor. He was a physician in a city called Porto Alegre in Brazil. He decided to mandate use, and they started a protocol in their city, in the entire metropolitan area. After ivermectin was adopted, boom, death rates dropped. If you look to the right, these are the other cities within that same state, that did not do it. Did you see a drop in death rates? You do not. India, same thing. A couple of states in India that developed it, they had some of the lowest rates in India, far lower than others. When you look at Bihar right here and Uttar Pradesh, they both adopted it in August, and you see these very low death rates compared to states that did not. And then this was a cool example from Paraguay. A governor of a state called Alto Parana, him and his brother got COVID. They were in their 50s. They were obese. They had diabetes. They took ivermectin, and they felt rapidly better. And so they just decreed throughout the region they were going to distribute ivermectin to all the population, and they essentially emptied the hospitals in that region. And so the governor went rogue. He went away from the federal health ministry, and he did this, and they had some of the lowest rates in the region compared to other cities in that region. So again and again, you see this. This is Mexico. The green line is the state of Chiapas, the only state in Mexico which adopted widely the use of ivermectin, and they completely behave differently than all the other states. This is a really cool story. I'll come back to this in a second. Let me skip. This is our protocol for early outpatient. This is my group. We have a prophylaxis one. If you are elderly or have comorbidities or illnesses, we prophylax. So many of us are actually on a prophylaxis protocol. We do recommend it every 2 weeks, although we are debating now whether it should be every week. I've now moved to every week based on a few cases of people who got sick taking it every 2 weeks. But it's overall actually still very protective, but optimal might be once a week. And then we have a post-exposure one. If someone in your family gets sick, we tend to prophylaxis the rest of the family. And then this is our early outpatient protocol where we treat for up to 5 days, a minimum of 2, maximum of 5, stop when you get better. And then we just have some immune fortifying medicines, which we believe are highly effective. And the combination we think is an optimal treatment protocol. Now, besides our group and my paper, a group in the United Kingdom of expert researchers who've written guidelines for the WHO. That's what they do. They are experts at reviews of the literature, formulating evidence, and they did this apart from the WHO because they saw that the WHO, listen to this, folks, was not doing their job. They were not providing guidance on ivermectin. They kept saying the data was insufficient. And so they amassed and did their own research of data. And they collaborated with 75 researchers from all the regions of the world, 16 different countries. And they basically followed the same protocol that the WHO does. And they took a vote on the evidence. They presented the evidence. They did a systematic review. This is where you can see the video of the meeting. And they assessed the evidence on many, many different qualities, not just the effects of the medicine, but the values, preferences, cost, and feasibility. Can you deploy this worldwide? And they basically came up with, at the bottom here, the strongest recommendation option for ivermectin to be adopted in both the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. The FLCCC and myself are not alone in our recommendations. Even the WHO Unitaid researcher, this is interesting. These were public lectures that he gave before he was asked by his sponsors to no longer give public lectures. And now you can ask yourselves why he's not giving public lectures anymore, because these conclusions that he was making were starting to depart from what the WHO wanted to say about ivermectin. And so he was asked to just do his research and stop talking about the data until they could analyze it. And I know this because he's told me, because we were doing talks together. And all of a sudden, I was asking him for more data and slides because he had more access to data than I would. And he, one day, this is about early, mid-February, told me that he couldn't do that anymore. But this is his last public talk in late of January. And he was compelled enough with the data that he said the purpose of this report, which is his talk, is to forewarn people this is coming. Get prepared, get supplies, get ready. The probability that the measured impacts on survival, that it's due to chance, is 1 in 5,000. And he said, similar to vaccines where they were bought even before they were proven effective, why can't we start to upscale ivermectin as well? Now, not everybody is following some of these large public health agencies that I think are very compromised to other influences. But a lot of regions and countries have gone rogue. They've departed from the WHO and some of the big US and European guidelines, and they've adopted in their national treatment. So there's a little breakaway republic in Eastern Europe, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, all made major moves to make it available and prescribed. Japan, the Tokyo Medical Association has become very vocal. They're trying to work with regulators to make it legal in Japan. Mexico, that's an interesting story, which I'll present in a few, which I find fascinating. And I think Mexico, what the outpatient, the Health Institute, what they did is I think they've done what's called a model for the world. South Africa has, as a result of almost a civil war in South Africa, where they've just been fighting in the courts and in the public against the regulatory agency, they finally won. The courts have now decreed that ivermectin can be compounded and used in the treatment in South Africa. So South Africa was great. We were helpful with a lot of our colleagues there. And so I could go on and on, but there's been a lot of adoptions. We've started this map because we really do consult, and we've helped a number of groups in these areas in formulating protocols and providing evidence. And we are seeing a slow grassroots movement. But if you look at Western Europe and North America, it looks pretty gray, doesn't it, guys? So maybe someday we'll see that turning green. And who knows, maybe Holland, if you imagine that. Never mind, I'm probably delusional. But maybe we'll get there. Hopefully you guys get my joke. I don't want to, this isn't an ego exercise, but I cannot stress enough the amount of things that myself and my group have identified and tried to disseminate to the world, and all of the health authorities keep missing this. It's basic medicine and science. And the problem is there's a huge difference between frontline clinicians like myself who are upfront with the disease. We see what it's acting like. We see what it needs. And then when you look at what these public health agencies recommending, it's like night and day. It's like they've never even seen the disease. They don't know anything about disease. And I'll tell you why. In those agencies, there's very few expert clinicians. But we long ago put out a critical cry for adequate vitamin D. I was one of the first to publish an editorial in a major newspaper in the United States that this disease is airborne transmission. I want to tell you folks, the WHO today still is not convinced that this is airborne transmission. It's absolutely absurd. It is clearly an airborne transmission disease, but yet they're still not convinced. I also define the disease as secondary organizing pneumonia. If those of you guys who aren't doctors, I'm not going to go into it, but it's why steroids are helpful and why they're critically needed. And I called out for corticosteroids. If you guys know, I testified in the Senate in December for ivermectin. I also testified in the Senate in May that everyone needs to treat the disease with steroids. And I will tell you that at that time that I made a very public statement for steroids. Every national and international public health agency in the world was saying, do not use steroids. And so when I came out with a very public recommendation, I was attacked and ridiculed for that recommendation. Guess what? 6 weeks later, it became the standard of care worldwide when Oxford did their big fancy study. We knew it was working. We knew it was critical. And this constant obsession with these large randomized controlled trials is really tiresome. I've done papers on phases of illness. I've published papers on hypercoagulability, and we've made different hospital as well as outpatient protocols. And now we're at the lead in the world on trying to disseminate the need for ivermectin. So I was fighting for corticosteroids back in the spring. Now I'm fighting for ivermectin here a year later, and I'm getting attacked again everywhere. This was my paper. For those of you who are physicians, I think this is a must read. It essentially defines the early pulmonary phase of COVID. It's an organized pneumonia, and that is the standard of care for organized pneumonia is corticosteroids. And I essentially prove that that's what it is in almost every patient. Everyone else thinks this is a viral pneumonia. For those of you at home, organized pneumonia is not an infection. It's a reaction to a lung injury. And everybody thinks this is a viral pneumonia, and it's tiresome. The entire world still calling it a viral pneumonia. It is not. The virus can be found in the lung in maybe 20% of people at most. Now, let's talk about briefly some of the things which I think you guys will understand. So let's change gears. I gave you what I think is convincing and overwhelming evidence base for ivermectin. So let's ask the question, how come ivermectin is not being recommended in many parts of the world, especially in North America and Europe? And this is what I've come to understand. This is one of the things that I've learned. It's now like ingrained into my brain and how I look at the world. But this is what's happening, especially in Western healthcare systems, is that it's a structure and function that's almost totally beholden to pharmaceutical companies. And the reason why that is, it's based on a certain structure and function which has evolved over time. But hear me out, it has solidified in COVID. What's happened is they've completely closed ranks, and now it's very hard to make a scientific advance if you don't meet the following criteria. Let's go over it. So right now, in order to get a medicine adopted, all of the public health agencies, they refuse to look at small trials anymore. They want what's called a proper trial or a massive randomized control trial. That's what RCT means. And generally, the kind of trial that they're looking for is they want all the patient level data, they want the protocols, they want everything to like the nth degree. And the kind of people who do those trials are generally on North American or European shores. So if you're in Kenya, Bangladesh, India, Argentina, anywhere, they don't really care. And so unless you do a proper large trial in one of those countries, and generally the only people who can fund those are what I call big pharma or big public health agencies, where they give a grant to fund it. And there's a problem there. You would think that they would study medicines that might be helpful and cheap and low cost, but they're not. They're heavily influenced. They give grants to oftentimes study novel pharmaceutical agents. But only those can really conduct the trials in which the PHAs want them, right? The public health agencies. And then the other thing is, the big journals are only interested in generally in publishing trials that come out of funding from big pharma or big public health agencies. So you can't get into a big journal until you have a big trial, which is funded by a big entity. And then once you publish such trial, you're good as gold. The media will cover you. They'll talk about how it's the standard of care, even if it's a ridiculous drug like remdesivir, which costs $3,000 a dose, doesn't save lives, might shave a couple of days off your hospitalization. It is absurd. This system is absurd. It has unleashed remdesivir on the world. The entire country, world of doctors, most of them are sheep, and I don't mean that I don't want to sound so derogatory. When I say sheep, meaning most doctors are unwilling to act outside of the power structures that tell them how to treat a disease. They're more than willing to follow those recommendations. And so when the big PHAs tell everyone you must use remdesivir, even though if it's on a questionable trial, it was a big pharma trial, the PHAs loved it, and they recommended it. So that has sufficient evidence and proven efficacy. Any medicine that doesn't meet these criteria, which is a large trial funded by big pharma or a big public health agency, published in a big journal, any other medicine, and you can just Google me or Google ivermectin, you will see the following terms everywhere in big media. Big media will say insufficient evidence and an unproven therapy. If you look at the data I showed, I cannot prove it more strongly than I did, with many, many different sources, countries, centers, and types of data all showing the same thing, which is a remarkable impact of ivermectin. Yet, all of these big entities will call it insufficient evidence. And then even worse in COVID is the big social media. They will censor any claims of any medicine working unless it comes out of a big journal and big PHA. And I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but if you write about ivermectin in YouTube, you're yanked. Twitter, you can get deplatformed. Facebook, you get removed or your page is frozen. So even if you're a credible scientist who's reviewed the data and give a very informed expert opinion on ivermectin, doesn't matter. I'm going to finish up here with an interesting development. So when you think about big science, I also have a slide. I'm not going to go into it, of what little science means. And I don't mean little science in a derogatory way, but it's basically anything that doesn't fall into this criteria, which is essentially everything in the history of medicine. It's what I do. I look at little different forms of evidence, observational trials, randomized trials, small, large, it doesn't matter. When you do a full assessment of the evidence, you can come to really sound conclusions. Now, let's talk about Mexico. I told you guys I wanted to talk about Mexico because I think it's critically important we understand what's happening in Mexico. This was an article in a Mexican publication. And what it did is it described what I would like to call a civil war. And I love this war because it's the IMSS, it's called the Instituto Mexico Social Seguridad, which it's actually their healthcare organization which controls the outpatient arena. The IMSS leaders in December put together and implemented what's called the test and treat protocol in all of the outpatient testing centers, meaning any patient who presents and gets treated, if they're positive, they get ivermectin. Meanwhile, the Federal Health Ministry, which is very tight with the WHO and probably compromised by big pharma, big PHAs, they're these very big regulatory agencies, they disagreed with this decision. And they're in a little bit of a fight. So this guy, Zoe Robledo, who's the head of IMSS, he's defending what he did. This guy from the Federal Health Ministry, this is the fame. Whenever you guys hear this, know that it's bullshit. There is no solid scientific evidence of the efficacy for the remission improvement. This is such a fraud. It's insane. You guys saw the data. To say there's no solid scientific evidence, all it means is there's no big RCT. They're all waiting for the big RCT, which they're not doing. So I just want you to look through that. Now, what happened is when they did this test and treat strategy, it's actually working well. I'll show you the data very soon, but there was a massive drop in hospitalizations and case fatality rates. So he's sitting here in the article, he's defending himself. We act ethically and with scientific evidence. It prevents cases infected from becoming complicated and reaching hospitalization. This is what they did. So it was December 29th when they instituted it throughout Mexico. This is what's called a case fatality rate. Now, guys, a case fatality rate is not affected by lockdowns. It's not affected by masks because it's once you get COVID, what is your rate of dying? And look at this and what's happening in the octogenarians, those over 80. After they started widely using ivermectin early on a positive test, it went from 30% mortality down to 23% mortality. 40 to 60-year-olds, it also almost halved. 60 to 80-year-olds, again, about a 40% drop. But you see this sudden, remarkable drop-off in case fatality rates. It shows you that ivermectin is working. This is, if you look here, January 1st, right? This is right when they started their program. There was a peak in hospitalizations. There's always a lag, and then a rapid fall off in COVID-19 hospitalizations. Same thing with fatalities, down to almost baseline pre-pandemic levels. So a dramatic improvement throughout Mexico. But look, and this is again the same director. He's making fun of the Ministry of Health. At least I think he's making fun of them. He's saying the Ministry of Health and the United States National Institute of Health say you have to continue researching before recommending its use, but we do not recommend stopping using it. To take a position to manage your patients is not done lightly. It is also done with panels of expert clinicians. I want to emphasize, these guys are listening to the doctors, not just the desk researchers and those who live in ivory towers. But contrast these statements with the Federal Health Ministry. This is so classic. I already showed you this guy and what he said. And then another guy from the Federal Health Ministry, all he does is he holds up the document from the WHO. It's really terrible what's happening in these big centers and big PHAs. Now, I also want to finish with what's happening with ivermectin has been described over decades. And what it's called disinformation. And I want you to know there's a disinformation campaign that is being propagated around ivermectin. And disinformation, it's been practiced by corporate and political interests for decades. It was first coined and popularized by big tobacco companies, where for years they sold tobacco while distorting and dismissing the science showing how harmful it was. Coal and oil industries, when they disrupt and distort the science around climate change. Here we have the sugar industry, which is telling us that sugar is good for us. And then we have the most recent is the National Football League, which is our American football, where they found that all these players were getting traumatic brain injury, and yet the NFL sought to dismiss and distort the science. That's what's happening with ivermectin. I want to be clear. I'm a scientist. It's disinformation what you're hearing. And I got to tell you who might be propagating that disinformation. I'll give you the list in a second. But these are the things they do. They either conduct trials which show the opposite of what is true. They harass scientists who speak out. I've had a number of magazine articles against me which are absolutely patently false, and they seek to make me a radical and a fringe scientist. And it's really troubling. And then what they love doing is they manufacture uncertainty about science where little or none exist. Ivermectin has an overwhelmingly powerful base. And then here's another one, is that they work through academic or professional societies. And they also can manipulate government officials. Now, here's some examples in history. You guys may know some of these, but a company named Georgia Pacific, they actually sought to try to remove knowledge of the dangers of asbestos. They manufactured trials showing that asbestos was not bad for you. Merck, our friends at Merck, they manipulated the science around their drug Vioxx. They tried to show science showing that it didn't cause heart attack. We knew it caused heart attacks at many, many times the rate of any other drug, but they sought to suppress that data because it was going to hurt their bottom line. The NFL, GlaxoSmithKline, they tried to go after the scientists for Avandia. America Chemistry Council, they tried to sow uncertainty about formaldehyde. It goes on and on. I don't know if you guys know what happened in this country with the opioid crisis, but this is probably, up until ivermectin, this was one of the most egregious campaigns of disinformation, which caused hundreds of thousands of deaths in this country due to an opiate crisis that was largely fueled by a pharmaceutical company. Now, if you wonder who might be against ivermectin, I had to do a screenshot because I couldn't make a slide big enough. But briefly, I think ivermectin, it's so effective at treatment and prevention that if it were to be recognized, please understand, if ivermectin would be recognized, it would decimate a market probably approaching $1 trillion. And the reason why I say that is that let's look at the list of who would be affected by ivermectin's efficacy. Number one, it would take away the emergency use authorizations of all the vaccines. And so if you had ivermectin, the vaccines would no longer have an EUA and you couldn't sell the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of vaccines. That's number one. Many companies make vaccines, even sovereign nations, right? So you have India, China, Russia, who are not only selling vaccines, but they're trying to use vaccine supply for geopolitical interests. They're trying to formulate closer relations with those that they supply. So it's a geopolitical interest. It's a massive financial interest, and that's just one of them. The other one is the numerous public health agencies who are part of this mass vaccination strategy. If ivermectin is shown to be effective in prevention, what's going to happen to vaccine hesitancy? How many people are going to line up for a vaccine shot if they know they could just take ivermectin? So I think they're deathly afraid of the data and science around ivermectin as prevention. And then there's a number of competing molecules that many of these companies are trying to bring to the market. They're in phase 2, phase 1, and phase 3 trials for early treatment, long-acting antibodies, monoclonal antibodies. What's going to happen to the market for remdesivir if suddenly, like in Mexico, the hospitalizations drop to nothing? How much remdesivir are they going to sell? So I can't come up with a list long enough of entities who do not want ivermectin to be approved. And I will tell you that in the next day or two, my white paper, where I outline all of this, and I outline clearly all the actions that have been documented, that the public health agencies have been done. The public health agencies are completely compromised by these other entities. They have been told, do not recommend ivermectin no matter what. And I find this to be a crime against humanity, and my only hope is that the historical record shows the harm that this disinformation campaign has exerted. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Shall we first? You are back again. Thank you very, very much for a very passionate and, as far as I'm concerned, quite convincing presentation. And I think viewers agree to a large extent with you, because we started with 101 viewers and we ended with 101 viewers. So that's a positive result, I'd say.
Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. And I have understood, but I couldn't follow it as quickly as it went. A lot of people have questions. And I'm going to, if you bear with me for a second, to get that list of questions. Dan probeer ik het maar. Because aan de moderators graag een indicatie van waar ik mee zou moeten beginnen. Was dat dan niet eerst, dan pak ik er gewoon een. Here is a question. In your opinion, what's the reason that governments and health authorities are united in opposing the use of ivermectin and similar medications, as it is obvious that these medications could save the lives of thousands of people? I think the WHO and national governments have a duty to always do everything possible to save human lives. When they apparently refuse to do so, should these governments, institutions, and medical leaders be held accountable by judicial tribunal? Well,
I'm going to answer briefly, because I believe that question was written before my last 3 slides, because I think I was pretty clear in as to why they're not recommending it. There are immense forces whose interests would be decimated if ivermectin was recommended. It would decimate the mass global vaccination policy, and it would interrupt it would basically decimate the demand for multiple pharmaceutical products. This is not a complicated answer. Everything is about self-interest, competing self-interest, and ivermectin is a grave risk to many public health policies and pharmaceutical company interests. I'm sorry, I never spoke like this before in my life. I've been battling for a year trying to get good scientific information to inform policy. The failure that we've had at informing policy has led us, as well as deep research, to the conclusion that this is not about the science. If you keep asking the question thinking that the answer is because the science isn't there, we tried to argue for months with public health agencies. I've sent numerous letters, numerous analyses of their faulty recommendations. Radio silence. They do not respond. They just keep not recommending. This is not about the science.
Okay, then there's a question by Thomas Levy, MD. He says that nebulizing H2O2 is very attractive. Hydrogen peroxide that is, isn't it? H2O2.
Yes.
Is very effective for viral infections and probably also for SARS-CoV-2. What do you think of that?
I think there's a lot of things that have shown good rationale and efficacy. I will say that I have lost interest in almost all of them, and I'll tell you why. Because of the astounding and overwhelming efficacy of ivermectin, one of the safest drugs known to mankind and sitting on one of the largest evidence bases. Even if H2O2 is helpful, I would ask these questions. A, why would you use it? Knowing that ivermectin has astoundingly high efficacy and safety. Number two, H2O2 will never happen. It will never be a credible therapy, and I'll tell you why. Even if it were to work, it's too cheap, and no one has any interest in promoting it. And number three, you need to do large trials. Remember, I talked about this system of big RCTs, big journals, big pharma, big academic medical centers. You can't get H2O2 into the castle. So if ivermectin can't get in there, H2O2 is not getting in there.
All right. What's your opinion on, well, no, I should phrase it like this. A year ago, we heard the same story about hydroxychloroquine.
So hydroxychloroquine is an interesting story because if you look at all of the trials, and there's been many, oh my gosh, there's so much data on hydroxychloroquine. The randomized controlled trials have been negative, but the observational control trials, and obviously observational control trials have limitations, but they're overwhelmingly positive, especially if given early. And I am very impressed with that early data. So I believe that hydroxychloroquine actually does work. You got to give it early, like within the first days. Remember, one of the problems with randomized controlled trials is they often have criteria of within 7 days, then they have to identify, randomize, get you the medication. And so they're always days late. And so when you see randomized controlled trials that are negative, but observational trials where the doctors are treating immediately very positive, my interpretation, because they're so overwhelmingly positive, is that it does work, but it has to be given very early. That's one point. The second point on hydroxychloroquine is I don't think it's nearly as effective as ivermectin. In fact, in the head-to-head trials, ivermectin is shown to have dramatic impacts above hydroxychloroquine. So although I like hydroxychloroquine as an early agent, I treat my patients with ivermectin.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then there's a question from a person called Karin Senese. I don't know if I pronounced it right. From what age can ivermectin be given?
So it can be given at any age. You know, for parasites, it's been given to, in fact, for Norwegian scabies back in the AIDS epidemic, it was given to infants. There is no age limit. I mean, it's a drug like any other. I mean, you can give a child a Tylenol, you can give them an aspirin, you can give them ivermectin. So there's no contraindication to age. The issue with age is that since it's such a mild disease in the young, I don't do prevention or prophylaxis in children. I only do it on high-risk older people. So I don't use ivermectin as a preventive, although I will do post-exposure prophylaxis, and I will treat them when they're sick.
Okay. How effective is ivermectin against the regular flu?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. Whoever asked that question, let's do a trial. So first of all, the flu is gone, right? For this year, there's almost no flu. And I think that's because of just ubiquitous mask wearing. So it's hard to do a trial on the flu right now. But based on the 10 years of trials in the lab showing effectiveness against Zika, dengue, West Nile, influenza, even HIV, it's my belief, and this is not data-driven, I'm just saying it's my belief that ivermectin may become, once the research is done over the next years, it may become one of the most potent antiviral agents. And so It might be very highly effective in flu. I don't know that, but it's my hope and it's my guess.
Okay. Someone here suggests nebulizing ivermectin.
I don't know why you would do that. I don't know why you would do that. It just doesn't make sense to me. You want to achieve blood concentrations of a reasonably high level. In fact, we advocate taking ivermectin with a meal because serum concentrations are much higher after a meal. So I don't know why you would nebulize it. It's not as effective a way as oral administration. Number one, it requires a nebulizer. It requires 20 minutes versus swallowing a pill. And all of the evidence is on oral administration. So unless someone provided some fantastic trials showing nebulized ivermectin is better than oral, I have no idea why I would nebulize it.
Okay. Someone quotes an article on the JAMA Network, Journal of the American Association, Eduardo Lopez Medina. He said, no difference.
Yeah. So I would ask that person, have you read the trial? They say no difference, but they found a difference. When I talk about big journals, big PHAs, big pharma, and I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but that trial, I got to tell you, big pharma and big journals, they love that trial because it allows them to publish a trial, which, remember what I said, guys, they are trying to insert doubt and uncertainty about a medication where none exists. If you look at that trial, it was a failed trial, meaning they constructed the trial thinking that out of 400 patients, 200 in each group, they were going to get about 80 patients who deteriorated. And they were going to try to see if there was more patients who deteriorated in placebo versus ivermectin. Do you want to know how many patients deteriorated out of 400 in that trial? The answer is 12. 12. The patients were so young and so mildly ill, they had almost no one deteriorate. So when you have 12 deteriorations out of 400, guess what? Also, fun fact here, folks, really fun fact. Of the 12, 4 got ivermectin and 8 got placebo. Okay. But the problem is it wasn't statistically significant. The crime is when you look at the abstract, which is what most of the world does, they don't read the paper. They look at the abstract because that's the headline. The headline says ivermectin doesn't work. But when you look at the trial and you find out that only 12 deteriorated, 4 got ivermectin, 8 didn't. And then the other thing is it actually says in the headline, read the headline again. It says the patients who got ivermectin got better on average 2 days sooner than placebo. Yet it wasn't statistically significant. But if you read the paper clearly states in the methods that they have the statistical power to detect a 3-day difference. They could only detect a 3-day difference to statistical significance. Yeah. And guess what they found? 2-day difference. Yeah. Can you conclude it doesn't work? No, all you conclude is that it wasn't powered to detect the difference they found. Yeah. I'm done. I can't talk about that trial. It's a crime.
Okay. This week, a couple of European countries seem to change position on early treatment. The Italian Senate approved early treatment. UK approved budesonide, outpatients treatment, and France is considering approving nitazoxanide. What's your take on this sudden change in behavior?
I think it's part of the grassroots movement that we're a part of, and that many people have recognized is that early treatment has been underemphasized and under-researched by our leading healthcare agencies, and it's causing harm. We don't want to wait for patients to get to the hospital. The doctor in Italy, Dr. Stremezzi, who championed that law, he has long recognized the need. He has many colleagues who've been treating early with good effect. He knows it works. So he went to the Senate. The real interesting thing is what that means. So when the Senate passes a law that the doctors have to use early treatment, I don't know what power that has. That's the Senate. That's not the health agency, but maybe it'll influence them. But it's a good sign. It shows that the people are awakening. Literally, the people are awakening. They're saying we've had it. There's a lack of leadership in this area, and they're trying to do what they can. That's one. The UK with budesonide, it should be reassuring. I don't find it so reassuring because they're doing that based on their big trial, and I am really underwhelmed with the results in that trial. Budesonide is fine. It might help a little bit. It's good. It's fine. But remember, they only did that because of the big trial. They didn't do that because a good doctor said they're having good results. Nitazoxanide has good rationale. It doesn't have a large evidence base, but I find that intriguing. I find it all hopeful. The fact that you're talking about relatively low cost repurposed drugs, I think those are really welcome exceptions.
Okay. Ivermectin is available, they say, I've never checked it, in pet shops. Is that the same ivermectin as is used in clinical trials as you give?
Yeah. So animal ivermectin and human ivermectin, it's the same. Ivermectin is ivermectin. The difference is the level of impurities in the products. Now, it's not perfect because there's many compounders who are not very well regulated, even on the human side. But in general, the level of impurities are much lower in the human grade product. So we don't know the safety of the animal ivermectin. I do know that many areas of the world have been taking it. We don't recommend it officially because we just can't. But that's my take on it. We don't have the safety on it. However, what we like to say is we also don't have evidence of toxicity. The FDA here in the United States, they put a sign on their website telling people don't take it. It's harmful. There's been hospitalizations. They have not provided any documentation of those hospitalizations. The best we can tell is that there's reports of 4 calls to a poison center in one state in the U.S. So it's not clear to me how toxic. We don't have definitive evidence of toxicity. We also don't have safety.
Okay. In Europe, let me say that right, a REMAP-CAP trial will be done on ivermectin. The Dutch board member is also an unpaid consultant for Johnson vaccines and Merck Sharp and Dohme. Would it be better to make sure he's not involved in the actual clinical trial? Well, I don't think we have much power over that, but...
So when we talk about... I would invite, when you see my white paper, if anyone's interested, come to our website in a day or two. We're going to post my white paper, basically outlining what's called a disinformation campaign around ivermectin. And I go through the tactics, sort of like I did in my talk, but I go through it a little bit more clearly. But there's an organization that's been around for about 50 years, and they're called the Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS. And they have been a major force in fighting back against disinformation. And they have a paper where they give guidance to society on how to fight back against, anti-science or disinformation campaigns. And one of them is that you need to remove those conflicts of interest from the conduct of science. So someone who's part of Merck, that is a natural competitor to ivermectin, who's heavily involved in the trial, let's say he is a good guy. Doesn't matter. What is he doing in that trial? It only should sow distrust and an ability to question the results. And so I think it's egregious. I don't think he should be part of the trial.
Okay. Is it correct that the very quick development and usage of a vaccine depends on the unavailability of medicines for prophylaxis?
That is our opinion. That is our interpretation of the documents which support the emergency use authorization. We believe that if an effective therapy is recommended and shown to be effective, it removes the emergency use authorization for the vaccines. And so in one swoop, the vaccines would be gone.
Okay. How to get ivermectin?
Yeah. So I assume that's a Dutch person who's asking.
Yeah.
So who I've done a lot of interviews with a man named Vince Everts. He's I think known as a trend spotter. So very nice guy, but he and I have done interviews, and he's in the Netherlands. Essentially, I think from what he's told me, he can't get it over. You can't get it over the counter. I don't know if can you guys, Theo, do you know, can doctors prescribe it in Holland? I don't think so. In fact, aren't they getting fined if they prescribe it in Holland?
The situation is there's advice against the use, but a doctor can prescribe it if he can find a pharmacist to support that.
Oh, right. That's what it is. Yes, I saw that document. So they're just making up silly rules. It just makes no sense. But the answer to the question, so in the US, we have a number of what are called telehealth providers. And on our website, we have a list of those telehealth providers. So when people ask us in the US, we'd say, just go to the telehealth providers, because at least on our list. In Netherlands or in Holland, I know that you can order it from India. You can order it from Asia. There's online pharmacies where you don't need a prescription. It's going to take a few weeks, but that's how I know quite a few Dutch people have gotten ivermectin, is that they order it from offshore.
Okay. The question here is whether you have any professional contacts with anyone at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam to discuss with them the FLCCC protocol.
No. So again, I want everyone to be clear on this. I am a physician. I've largely worked in big academic medical centers. I've given lectures. I've championed a number of therapies. I'm well known in my specialty. In COVID, myself and my organization, we have not spent any more effort trying to convince doctors of anything. It is completely fruitless. The only doctors that we can help are those that seek us out. We cannot change doctors. There's a wall there. They're not listening to outsiders. They're listening to the leading public health agencies. I have zero interest in talking to anyone at Erasmus unless they call me first.
Okay. Well, this is someone asks for your slides. Well, I suppose
Sure.
we can make them available.
Yeah, I'll send them to you after.
Yeah, of course. Can you explain the argument of monkey kidney high required concentrations in vivo? An argument made against ivermectin use. Why is it so persistent? And the first thing you hear when you look for an answer.
Again, I'm going to teach your audience how to interpret what they hear. So that's another telltale sign of disinformation. So very clearly, the first study done in Monash on monkey kidney cells used very high concentrations. Okay, every public health agency has leapt on that and saying you can't use it, it won't work. See, that trial doesn't work. Now, number one, no scientist who does that kind of research will ever tell you that there's a tight correlation between a cell culture and the human model. So to pretend that one is the other is completely distorting the science. That's one. Number two, monkey kidney cells have nothing to do with what we're looking at, which is actually in human tissue. The group from Australia has repeated that experiment using lung cells, human lung cells, and they have found, this is unpublished data, they have found that a standard dose of ivermectin reaches the concentrations you need to kill the virus in that. So even in a cell culture model, standard dose works. Number two. Number three, the mechanism of action in that first study is only one of about 3 or 4 that we think are happening. And there are other studies showing that standard doses interrupt other mechanisms. Number four, if that study were true in the monkey kidney cells, then I would not be before you today talking about the dozens of observational and randomized controlled trials showing high efficacy with standard dosing. It is absurd. Any public health agency, and they keep doing it. Every day I read it from them. Every time they try to dismiss ivermectin, they always bring that up. They always bring that up. You will never be able to reach the concentrations. They are lying. If not lying, they are willfully ignorant of the science behind it.
Okay. I'm reading it. I don't understand it myself. IVM prevention. What's ivermectin prevention, of course.
Yeah.
By taking the pills every 2 weeks, vaccines protect longer. Is there still any sense in combining them?
So you can take ivermectin alone regularly. So I have many colleagues and friends, some as long ago as July, who've been taking either every week or 2 weeks, and they've been perfectly protected. We've had a few cases of COVID on the 2-week protocol. The Indian protocols of once a month are actually showing pretty good protection there. So anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks to once a month. You can take it as long as you want. It's a very safe medicine. Now, does it make sense to take it with vaccines? So that's a tricky one. I think that's an individual decision, and I would call that shared decision-making with your doctor, if your doctor knows ivermectin, which is probably unlikely because your doctor's taught to ignore ivermectin. But if you have a doctor willing to prescribe ivermectin, this is how I approach it. So, for instance, I'll give you the case of my parents. My father's 89, my mother's 80, both in good health. My father still works. They got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine about a month and a half ago, which is about 65 to 70% protective. They take ivermectin. They still take ivermectin along with having been vaccinated. Some of the other vaccines, which much higher efficacy, suggest maybe you don't need ivermectin for perfect protection. But here's the issue, is it's such a fluid situation, right? There's not a day that goes by without a report of a new variant and a lower efficacy of a vaccine. So who knows at every given moment how good your vaccine is protective? And so I don't know. I keep it simple. I just take ivermectin. I'm not vaccinated.
Oh, why are you not vaccinated?
Pass.
Did you take ivermectin or?
I'm going to take a pass on that, Deo.
Side effects? Too early on the market?
Vaccine?
Sorry?
I don't want to talk about vaccines. I just want to keep it to ivermectin.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. We run somewhat out of questions, if there are any more questions, but we'd like to ask the audience, and there's still 97 people online, so you've done a good job so far. Which of the audience takes a vaccine?
Was that a question for me or the audience?
Oh, because you've already partly answered it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, then another question about the disease itself. Do you consider COVID-19 similar to influenza? Much different?
No, it is. It is a catastrophic illness in magnitudes more than influenza. Yeah, that's a really strange notion. So as an ICU doctor who's been practicing for a decade and a half through flu pandemics, regular seasons, I don't think the person who asked that question knows what's happening in the hospitals.
Well,
there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation going on, but here's what I'll tell you. I'll just give an example. I was working for a big center in Milwaukee in December, and it's a big center with lots of intensive care unit beds. The entire medical ICU, which was 24 beds, was all COVID, and they all looked the same. Every patient was the same. Horrifically inflamed lungs on high amounts of oxygen and ventilators. That does not happen in the flu, not even close. and in what happened in New York, what happened in Italy and Seattle, some of those early outbreaks. I mean, hospitals were filling and overflowing with patients dying of failing lungs from COVID. The pulmonary phase of COVID is absolutely devastating. Now, where it is like the flu is in the vast majority outside the hospital. So remember, if you get 100 patients with COVID, 80 do fine. It acts like a cold or the flu, and that's where it's probably like the flu. But then in 20, you get some who will get quite a bit sicker, and I think it's about 5% that come into the hospital. And that is a wicked disease, and 5% is magnitudes higher than the amount of people with the flu who get hospitalized. I mean, come on, whoever asked that question, I mean, hospital systems have cratered. Health systems have collapsed. Like, what if I have colleagues in Zimbabwe, there were areas where they ran out of oxygen, even in LA County in December. Los Angeles, part of US, they were running out of oxygen. Oxygen systems were breaking in the hospitals. They had to put patients in gift shops, because they were running out of rooms. The flu does not do that. Sorry, I get a little emotional because I've been fighting COVID, and this is a wicked disease.
It's a relevant question, nevertheless.
Yes, it is.
Does warm cure works like mebendazole, been on the market since 1972? It's available without a prescription on the brand name Warm Cure. Mebendazole.
Oh, see, albendazole. Yeah, I've heard a couple of snippets around that. I just don't have data on it, and I don't. It doesn't have the same mechanism of action as ivermectin, so it might work. There's just no data for me to comment.
Yeah, okay. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a mention of a shortage of incubators, ventilating machines, and Trump ordered immediately to have a few million of them produced. And thereafter, the next thing we heard was that those machines were more killing than life-saving. And supposedly the world has a large surplus of ventilating machines today. I don't know.
Yeah.
Tell me.
Yes. So that's very true. And again, I as an expert in my field, I've seen repeated colossal errors in the understanding and treatment of disease. The first one was the widespread colossal error around ventilation. And I will tell you that when COVID first came, I was the chief of the critical care service at the University of Wisconsin, which is a major university in the United States. And a lot of people were coming to me, and they wanted me to champion a protocol of early intubation. And I said, that is absolutely insane. That is ridiculous. We are not going to intubate patients early. And I'll tell you why people wanted to intubate early. Everybody was scared. Everybody was scared because everybody heard stories that the patients decline rapidly. And you don't want a patient to be rapidly declining when you put them on a ventilator. So I think this mass psychology developed where people thought the right thing to do was put them on early. But look what happened. When you put them on early, ventilators, there's an interesting concept around a ventilator, is that they're double-edged swords. They save lives, but they also hurt patients. And the challenge, and one of the ever-growing challenges, which actually stimulates me as a physician, is you want to institute a ventilator not too early and not too late. The problem was this was a novel disease. We didn't know the dynamics, and many people around the world chose too early. I fought for not too early, and I will tell you, we did not intubate patients until they clearly needed it. We never come close to running out of ventilators, and we had pretty good outcomes. I think the system had to learn that. So the first few months, I think they made a colossal and widespread error of putting patients on. As they learned the disease and they realized the patients really just needed oxygen and not a ventilator, you saw a lot less ventilators, lower mortality rates, and you didn't run out of ventilators. So listen, in hindsight, I think that was a colossal error made, that the idea that we needed more ventilators, no, you just needed better doctoring.
What cured Trump?
Oh, that's a fascinating story. So he took a whole bunch of stuff. I will say, I guess I'll say this publicly because I just don't care anymore. But I have gotten word through pretty reputable source that he actually took ivermectin, and it's not public. Now, remember, you can't believe everything around Trump, right? He's a liar. His whole administration was full of liars. So, but I know someone who's pretty close, who actually understand. This person knew ivermectin was effective, and actually was a Trump supporter. He got ivermectin to Trump, and Trump took ivermectin. That's what I'm told. But he also took a whole bunch of other stuff, including many elements of our protocol, including melatonin, aspirin, vitamin D. I think he might have taken quercetin. I don't know.
Regeneron is credited.
Yeah, but that doesn't work. That's nonsense. It wasn't the Regeneron.
Regeneron doesn't work? No?
No, that's fake news.
Sorry, I can't check it. Then do you have an explanation for the sudden drop of cases of COVID in the Czech Republic?
Cases or deaths?
Here, I don't know. Here it says cases.
Yeah, I mean, so it depends. Yeah, I don't know what timeline that person is referring to, and I haven't gotten recent data on Czech Republic.
March 12th.
March 12th. What are we now? April? Well, it's a good question because right around then or before then, the Czech Republic, they didn't necessarily approve ivermectin, but they allowed it to be used. And I know there was mass importation. I also know there was mass confiscation. So it's a little messy in Czech Republic. But let me just say this. The rises and falls of cases and deaths in a number of countries is fairly complex. We have seen repeated, just like I presented, we've seen repeated responses to ivermectin approvals and distributions. And I will tell you, it was right around March 12th that Czech Republic moved to allowing ivermectin use. So this is what I'll say. It lies within the realm of possibilities that ivermectin is driving that. I can't say for sure. Okay.
There is mention of a trial, an RCT running by Huve Pharma here in Europe. You know anything about it?
Yeah, so that's in Bulgaria. If I'm understanding correct, I think he's talking about Uvemac, Huvemac, and that's a Bulgarian company which has a formulation of ivermectin. But that trial is done already. Maybe they're doing a bigger one, but it's already profoundly positive. They showed statistically significant reduction in the time to viral clearance, time to clinical recovery. Did they show mortality? No, it wasn't mortality, but they showed decreased hospitalizations, time to clinical recovery, and viral clearance in the Bulgarian trial.
Already?
What's that?
Published already?
It's on a preprint, if I recall correctly. Okay. I have the paper.
That I understood. Yeah. Okay. Well, that seems to be all the questions that I have. And I just, 93 viewers still, and it's 21:33. And that could partly curing the long post-COVID group, the long COVID.
My favorite question.
Yeah.
My favorite question. Best answer I can give is go to our website, www.flccc.net, and look for the webinar videos. I do one every week, and I did one on long haul COVID about 4 weeks ago. And I really go over just really compelling evidence. I have treated with incredible success a number of cases of long COVID with ivermectin. Number of researchers in Peru. I get testimonials every day. In fact, I have a Word document of these incredible testimonials of people with symptoms 6 to 8 months who take ivermectin and they feel better within days. So it's extremely effective, in my opinion, against long COVID. I have too much experience. I don't have great trials. We have a couple of case series that have been posted, but my experience has been dramatically positive.
Okay. Are you aware of clinical trials with low-dose radiation for terminal pneumonia patients?
Yeah, so radiation and COVID, yeah, I mean, that was something that I was quite intrigued by. Yeah, I know that there's trials on it. Again, I hate to be dismissive of everything, but I am so not interested in that, and I'll tell you why. It's just not scalable. It's not going to be an effective therapy for humanity.
I mean, in the first half of the previous century.
Right. No. But what I'm saying, even if it does work, how are you going to provide it to the population? I mean, like in low-income countries, middle-income countries, the thousands of people who are ill. I just don't think it's feasible on a large scale, although it might be effective. Yeah. I would still, even if it is effective, I would want to see a head-to-head of radiation versus.
Yeah, of course.
Tell me it's better than ivermectin, then I'll sign up for it.
You won't see it because they're both cheap. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, ivermectin eradicates the virus, and vaccines drive the virus to immune escape, which create more variants. Is that right?
Oh, but by far the vaccines would create more variants. I mean, there's been really interesting lectures by vaccine experts, and I would be very clear to point out those vaccinologists and immunologists who have given lectures publicly will tell you very quickly into their lectures that they're independent, meaning they're not employed by a facility, an organization, or a company. And they seem to be the only ones speaking out. But quite a few of those experts have expressed caution that these vaccines, to unleash them in the middle of a pandemic, will fuel variants. That's number one. Number two, ivermectin is doing so well against multiple variants. It has multiple mechanisms of action, not a single one like the vaccine. And it's been doing great against the South Africa variant, the Brazil variant, and the UK variant. So, yeah, that's not even close. It's not even close.
The last one then. Dr. Hill mentioned in January that a lot of trials were supposed to finish in February and March, but only the Bulgarian and Colombia studies have been published. You know what's causing the delay?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I like that question, that person's paying attention. So right after January is when Dr. Hill kind of stopped sharing his data with us. He was asked to only share it with other health agencies, and I don't think the other health agencies care. They haven't been asking him. So he hasn't shared them with us, but we have talked, and a couple of things happened. So he has data from a few trials in February. The disappointment, from what I understand from him the last time I talked to him or emailed him, is that the ones that were supposed to come on March 19th, they were a couple of big ones. They just weren't ready. Like the data was too messy and rough, and it just hasn't. I would just say the short answer is the data, as I've understood it, hasn't really. They passed their deadline, and they still need to do a fair amount of data analysis and organization.
There's this video on your site, FLCCC.net, where you plead your case before the Senate, and it looks, for instance, like what's his name, Rand Paul, was quite sympathetic. Has anything come of that?
Well, so since that testimony, few weeks after that, we were asked to present our data to the National Institutes of Health.
Okay.
And we presented our data, and they changed their recommendation from, they had a recommendation of, we recommend against use of ivermectin outside of a clinical trial. That was their old recommendation. And after myself, Dr. Marek, and Andrew Hill, we presented together. I asked Andy because he had more data than we did. After our presentation, they changed it to, there is insufficient evidence to recommend for or against. So they left it as neutral.
Okay.
I thought I was very satisfied they changed it, as well as disappointed. More disappointed than satisfied.
I can understand that. Is anything to say about the role of Dr. Fauci in this? Because he seems to be a very central person in that. No? Okay.
I mean, all I can say is if he had an interest and was drawn to or wanted to devote resources into the research into repurposed drugs, you would see evidence of that. There's been very little research into repurposed drugs. Everything's been vaccines and novel monoclonal antibodies and all this nonsense. Now, having said that, there are a couple of trials now starting that are falling under the roof of the NIH. But I mean, it's a year later. They haven't even started yet. And I actually think they're unethical because you're basically giving placebo to patients where the evidence is overwhelming that it's that you should use ivermectin. Again, the expert panels that have done the reviews, all of us say that placebo-controlled trials at this point are unethical. I could never consent a patient, knowing what I know about ivermectin, it violates medical research ethics. You can't do it.
I understand. Okay, we're going to finish this. Thanks very much, and all the information will be published online. You're a very strong force for the case, and we'll see what comes of it. Yeah.
We're going to keep fighting. I mean, it's just insane what we're up against. It's really sad. Very, very sad.